evening. I bid you welcome. There is something I wish to show you. Do you see this? To the uninformed eye, it might appear as a shard of garnet, perhaps a drop of wine frozen by time, but it is known by a name far more ancient and stirring: dragon's blood. From the tree that bleeds. Tonight, we shall venture beyond the myths of fire and scale. We shall uncover the truth of this crimson treasure, a substance that has traveled from the remote islands of the Arabian Sea to the finest workshops of Cremona. We shall explore its virtues as a healer of wounds, its secrets as a master's varnish, and its enduring power in the rituals of the world. Should you find these quiet ruminations upon the natural world to your liking, marking your attendance with a like or subscribe ensures our modest establishment remains open for all your future inquiries into the mysteries of the materia medica. Now, let us settle in. The night is long, and the story of the dragon tree is older than us all. What is dragon's blood now? What is this dragon's blood? You may rightly ask. It is, in its essence, a resin. A resin, mind you, not a true blood at all, though its appearance might deceive the uninformed eye. This resin is drawn from the living sap of certain trees and palms. When it hardens and dries, it presents itself as a substance of remarkable depth of color, a red so profound, so rich, that it calls to mind the darkest wine, or perhaps the color one observes in certain garnets held up to candlelight. This dragon's blood has been prized across a great span of the known world, and I do mean prized, for it commands no insignificant price in Europe, certainly where I ply my trade, but also in the lands of the Middle East, throughout the vast territories of Asia, and even so I am informed by travelers of reliable character in the Americas. It is a substance that knows no singular master, no single kingdom. It has been valued, you see, for its manifold uses. As a dye, dragon's blood provides a color of exceptional fastness and intensity. The color it imparts is not easily washed away, not easily faded by the passage of time or the assault of sunlight. As a varnish, it lends a protective coat, a lustrous finish to fine woodwork and to the instruments of musicians. I have seen it applied to violins of exquisite craft, where it mingles with other resins to create that particular warm glow so admired by connoisseurs. But it is as a medicine that dragon's blood has most occupied the attention of we apothecaries, a medicine of multiple purposes. You understand, we have valued it, generation upon generation, for its astringent properties. An astringent, for those unfamiliar with the terminology of physic, is a substance which causes the tissues of the body to contract, to draw together, thereby reducing the flow of fluids. This quality makes dragon's blood particularly useful in the treatment of wounds. When a wound bleeds freely, as wounds are wont to do, the application of dragon's blood resin can assist in staunching that flow. Properly prepared, of course, the blood, you see, ceases its escape more readily. This same astringent quality recommends it for internal complaints, bleeding of the stomach or bowels, excessive monthly flows in women, and various afflictions of the digestive organs, where a tightening might prove beneficial. Multiple sources now. I must clarify, for clarity in these matters is of utmost importance. This dragon's blood is not derived from a single source. No, indeed. It comes to us from the sap of several entirely unrelated families of plants. This is a fact which causes some confusion in the marketplace, and indeed some opportunity for the unscrupulous to pass off inferior specimens as the genuine article. The principal genera, and I list them now for the sake of completeness, are these Dracaena, which is to say the dragon trees proper, then Croton, a genus of considerable variety, Daemonorops, which are certain palms of the East Indies, and Pterocarpus, timber trees of substantial size. These four genera, you understand, are not related one to another in the botanical sense. They belong to different families entirely, yet each produces, through its own particular mechanisms, a red resinous substance. A substance which has been called in commerce and in common usage dragon's blood. This multiplicity of sources is a phenomenon which never ceases to provoke contemplation. This coming together of unrelated plants to produce similar substances. Why should Providence ordain that trees of such different character should each yield up a crimson resin of similar appearance? Trees growing in such disparate regions of the earth. It is a question I have pondered many an evening in this very chamber. The name and its origins, let us turn now to the matter of nomenclature, to the question of how the substance came to bear so peculiar a name. Dragon's blood. The very words conjure images of legend, of ancient tales told by firelight. And indeed, one might reasonably suppose that no actual dragon contributed to the production of this resin. Yet the name persists, and has persisted now for many centuries. The earliest appearances of this name in texts available to us date to the 1st century of the Common Era. The Greco-Roman sources of that period make mention of a red gum obtained from the island of Socotra, written in Greek and in Latin by physicians and natural historians. Socotra, you should understand, lies in the Arabian Sea, at the mouth of the Gulf of Aden, a considerable distance to the east of here. These ancient sources describe the substance arriving along the Indian Ocean trade routes, those maritime passages by which the merchants of Rome obtained the silks, the spices, and the rare medicinals of the Orient. Dragon's blood traveled, then as now, as an article of commerce, passing from hand to hand across great distances before arriving in the shops of apothecaries in Rome, in Alexandria, in Athens. The name itself became a subject of debate among scholars of the Renaissance period. And in our own early modern age, some learned men have suggested that the name represents a learned error, a mistranslation perhaps, or a misunderstanding of some account in an ancient text perhaps. They argue a metaphorical description was taken literally. Perhaps the deep red color alone suggested the blood of the mythical beast, and the name adhered through repetition. Other scholars, however, have proposed that the name was deliberate, and I confess I find their arguments not without merit. That is to say, it was a stratagem of marketing, if you will. An exotic name, a name suggesting rarity and power, commands a higher price than a prosaic description might. A merchant who offers the blood of dragons will find more ready buyers than one who merely offers red tree resin, human nature being what it is. The mysterious and the legendary have always possessed greater allure than the mundane. This debate continued for some considerable time. Indeed, it continues still in certain quarters. Renaissance scholars examined the ancient texts with great care, comparing descriptions, attempting to determine the true botanical origin of the classical dragon's blood. Was it the same substance that arrived in their own times from the East Indies? Or had the identity of the source plant been lost and rediscovered? Perhaps more than once across the centuries. The question, you understand, is complicated by the fact that multiple plants produce resins of similar appearance. As I have already noted, it is entirely possible, indeed quite probable, that the dragon's blood of the ancient world and the dragon's blood of our own time are not derived from the same botanical source. The merchants of Socotra may have traded resin from Dracaena cinnabari, the dragon tree native to that island. Meanwhile, the dragon's blood arriving in Venice or Lisbon in our own century might well come from the rattan palms of Sumatra or from the proton trees of the Americas. Yet all of it bears the same name. All of it is sold as dragon's blood, and all of it possesses that same deep crimson color. That color which, when held to the light, glows with an almost unearthly intensity, as though some vital essence had been captured and concentrated within it. Trees, sap, and collection good. Let us proceed now to consider the manner by which this resin is obtained, the process, if you will, by which it passes from the living tree into the hands of those who would use it. The resin, which we call dragon's blood, is, as I have stated, an exudate. That is to say, it is a substance which flows forth from the tree under certain conditions. In the text which we apothecaries consult, the herbals, the materia medica, the accounts of travelers, the resin is described as a sap-like material, one that oozes slowly and with a certain reluctance from cuts made in the bark of the tree picture, if you will, the collector making his incisions. He approaches the tree with his blade, perhaps a knife designed for this specific purpose, curved in a particular manner to penetrate the bark without causing excessive damage to the living wood beneath. He makes his cut a deliberate wound in the protective covering of the tree. And then he waits. The sap does not gush forth as water from a spring. No, it emerges gradually, seeping from the injury in the bark. At first, the substance is viscous, sticky, possessing a consistency not unlike honey, though its color is immediately apparent. That deep, blood-like red which gives the resin its name. One might observe it on a warm day, when the heat of the sun makes the sap flow somewhat more freely. Though never rapidly, never in great quantity, this exudate, the slow bleeding of the tree, is collected carefully. In some regions, collectors allow the resin to accumulate upon the bark itself, where it forms tear-shaped droplets or irregular masses. In other places, they may provide receptacles, small containers, or even leaves fashioned into cups to catch the precious substance before it hardens upon the tree, and harden it does with remarkable speed once it has ceased to flow. Exposed to the air, the resin undergoes a transformation. It loses its liquid character, its viscosity. It becomes solid, brittle even, masses which result glassy in appearance, possessing a peculiar translucence when held to the light. If one were to strike such a piece of hardened resin, it would shatter rather like glass, breaking into sharp, edged fragments. This brittleness, this glassy quality, proves most suitable for the purposes of the apothecary. We require the resin in powder form for many of our preparations, for incorporation into tinctures, into salves, into pills and electuaries. A brittle substance is easily ground. One places the hardened resin in a mortar of stone or of bronze, depending upon the quantity one means to prepare, and applies the pestle with steady, circular motions. The resin yields to this treatment, breaking down first into coarse fragments, then into progressively finer particles. The powder, which results, retains that deep red color, though it appears somewhat lighter than the solid resin due to the way the fine particles catch and scatter the light. This powder, I should note, possesses a faint scent, not unpleasant, somewhat resinous and earthy, with a quality that brings to mind certain incenses. Now, in the Dracaena species, those dragon trees which I mentioned earlier, the production of this resin serves a particular function for the tree itself. It is not, you understand, a gift which the tree freely offers to mankind. Rather, the resin functions as a wound sealant, a natural plaster which the tree produces in response to injury. When the bark of a Dracaena is damaged, whether by the deliberate cut of a collector's knife, or by the browsing of an animal, or by the breaking of a branch in the wind, the tree responds. It produces this red resinous material. The resin flows into the wound, and as it hardens, it forms a protective barrier. This barrier prevents the entry of moisture, of fungal spores, of insects that might bore into the exposed wood. It seals the injury, allows the tree to heal beneath this natural bandage. This same resin also serves as an ecological defense. Its astringent properties, those very properties which we apothecaries value for staunching bleeding in human patients, make it unpalatable to many creatures that might otherwise feed upon the tree. The taste is intensely drying, puckering to the mouth. Animals which sample the resin once are unlikely to do so again. Thus we see that what serves the tree as protection serves mankind as medicine. It is a pleasing symmetry, this correspondence between the needs of the plant and the uses to which we put its products, trade and movement through the world having considered how the resin is obtained. Let us now turn our attention to the manner of its movement across the world. For dragon's blood has traveled great distances, passed through many hands, before arriving in establishments such as mine. The resin obtained from Dracaena cinnabari, that particular species which grows upon the island of Socotra, entered into commerce in ancient times. Socotra, as I have mentioned, lies in the Arabian Sea. From this remote island, the resin was transported by ship to the Arabian coast, and thence overland along what scholars have termed the Incense Road. This Incense Road, and the name derives from frankincense and myrrh, which traveled the same routes, was an ancient network of caravan paths, connecting the southern reaches of Arabia with the Mediterranean world. Camels, laden with precious goods, made their slow way northward, stopping at oases, at market towns. Each journey consuming weeks or months of time. The dragon's blood resin traveled alongside other aromatics, other medicinals. It moved from merchant to merchant, each taking his portion of profit before passing the goods onward. By the time it reached the markets of Damascus, of Tyre, of Alexandria, the price had multiplied many times over from what was paid to the collectors on Socotra. Yet still there were buyers, for the substance was valued, and rarity commands price. In the medieval period, that long span of centuries following the fall of Rome and continuing into the Renaissance, Europe continued to import dragon's blood. The trade routes had shifted somewhat. Now, the resin arrived primarily through the spice and incense networks controlled by Arab merchants, and later by the maritime powers of Venice and Genoa. Ships sailing from the Indies would carry dragon's blood along with pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and all the other costly goods of the East. The journey was long, perilous even. Ships might be lost to storms, to pirates, to simple navigational error. Those vessels which did arrive safely in Mediterranean ports brought their cargoes to the great trading houses, and from there the goods were distributed throughout Europe. One must understand that distance and time were very different matters in those centuries. The quantity of dragon's blood might be a year in its journey from the tree to the apothecary shop, perhaps longer. The resin would be collected, transported to a regional market, sold to a merchant who specialized in forest products, then to another who dealt in exports, then loaded aboard ship, carried across vast expanses of ocean, unloaded at a port, sold again to an importer, transported overland to another city, sold to a wholesale dealer in drugs and spices, and finally purchased by an apothecary such as myself. Each transaction added to the price. Each hand through which it passed took its due. This is the nature of commerce, the reality of trade in goods that cannot be obtained locally. The historical materia medica, those texts which catalogue and describe medicinal substances, took care to distinguish between multiple commercial types of dragon's blood. The scholars who compiled these works understood that the name encompassed resins from different sources, and they attempted to clarify these distinctions for the benefit of their readers. Some dragon's blood arrived in the form of small tears or drops. Individual pieces of resin carefully sorted by size. This was considered a mark of quality. Such resin had been collected with care, kept clean, not adulterated with bark or other impurities. Other dragon's blood came in larger masses, irregular lumps where multiple exudations had merged together. Still, other forms existed, resin that had been collected and then processed in various ways, perhaps melted and formed into cakes or sticks for easier transport. The pharmacopoeias, those official books which list and standardize medicinal substances, developed specific nomenclature to distinguish between these various types. They listed different botanical sources under Latin names, such as Sanguis draconis palmarum and Sanguis draconis pterocarpi. Sanguis draconis palmarum, you understand, refers to the dragon's blood obtained from palms, specifically from the Daemonorops species, those rattan palms of the East Indies, from which one variety of the resin is collected. The name tells the informed reader this is palm-derived dragon's blood. Sanguis draconis pterocarpi indicates dragon's blood from pterocarpus trees, large timber trees which produce their own red resinous material. This distinction matters because although all are called dragon's blood, and although all share that characteristic crimson color, they are not identical in their properties. Subtle differences exist in hardness, in solubility, in the precise shade of red, in medicinal efficacy. An apothecary of careful practice learns to recognize these differences. He examines the resin he purchases, noting its form, its color when held to light, how cleanly it breaks, how it behaves when ground, how readily it dissolves in alcohol or in oils. These observations inform his judgment of quality and guide his choice of which dragon's blood to employ for which purpose. The trade in dragon's blood continues in our present day, though the specific routes and the dominant powers in that trade have shifted with the times. Where once Arab merchants and Italian city-states controlled the flow of Eastern goods, now other nations have established their own trade routes, their own colonies and trading posts in distant lands. Yet the fundamental pattern remains unchanged. The resin is still collected, still transported across great distances, still sold and resolved until it reaches those of us who compound it into medicines, into dyes, into varnishes. The journey of dragon's blood through the world is a slow one, measured not in days but in seasons, marked by the patient movement of goods from hand to hand, from ship to shore, from warehouse to shop, until at last it finds its use. Forms seen by the apothecary. Let me describe now the various forms in which dragon's blood presents itself to the apothecary. The physical shapes and configurations in which this resin arrives at my counter, ready for preparation, and use the dragon's blood, which I purchase from the druggists and importers, comes in several distinct forms. Each form, I should note, has its particular advantages and its particular indications of quality. An experienced apothecary learns to judge the value and purity of the resin by its appearance, by its form. The first and perhaps most valued form is what we term tears. These are small, rounded pieces of resin, each one having formed as an individual droplet upon the bark of the tree. The tears are typically the size of a pea, or perhaps somewhat larger, rarely exceeding the dimensions of a small bean. Their shape is naturally rounded, though not perfectly spherical, showing the pattern of how the viscous resin hung and hardened upon the bark before being collected. These tears, when of good quality, are clean. That is to say, free from admixture of bark fragments, dirt, or other foreign matter. They possess a glossy surface, a deep translucent red color that glows when held between the fingers before a candle flame. The light passes through them, revealing their internal structure, their clarity. Such tears command the highest price, and rightly so, for they represent resin collected with care and sorted with attention to quality. Another common form is the stick. Dragon's blood in stick form has been processed after collection. The raw resin has been melted, or at least softened by heat, and then formed into cylindrical shapes. Sticks of various thicknesses, some no larger around than a quill pen, others as thick as a man's thumb. These sticks are then wrapped, often in leaves or in thin sheets of paper, to keep them clean during transport and storage. The stick form has certain practical advantages. It is easier to handle, easier to break into portions of desired size. When one requires a specific quantity of resin, it is a simpler matter to break off a measured length of stick than to count out numerous individual tears. However, the processing required to create sticks means that this form may contain resin of somewhat lesser purity, pieces that would not qualify as fine tears, smaller fragments. Resin mixed with small amounts of bark may be melted together in the creation of sticks. The third form, commonly seen as irregular lumps or masses. These are precisely what the name suggests: formless pieces of hardened resin, varying greatly in size and shape. Some are quite small, others may be as large as a hen's egg or even larger. These lumps represent resin that has simply accumulated and hardened upon the tree, or that has been collected without sorting by size or quality. Lumps of dragon's blood are the most variable in character. Some may be of excellent quality, clean and pure. Others may contain visible impurities, fragments of bark embedded in the resin, or areas where the color is less uniform, indicating perhaps that different grades of resin have fused together. An apothecary must examine such lumps carefully, breaking them open if necessary to judge their internal quality. Now, regardless of the form in which dragon's blood arrives, we apothecaries must prepare it for use. The resin, as purchased, is not yet in a condition suitable for most medicinal applications. It must be further processed, transformed into forms that can be readily incorporated into our various preparations. The most basic preparation is grinding. As I mentioned earlier, the hardened resin yields readily to the mortar and pestle. We grind it into powder, sometimes a coarse powder, if it is to be used in certain preparations, more often a fine powder that feels smooth when rubbed between the fingers. This powder can then be measured with precision using scales incorporated into pills or electuaries, or mixed with other powdered ingredients. The grinding of dragon's blood requires some patience. If one attempts to work too quickly, applying excessive force, the resin may fly from the mortar in sharp fragments. It is better to work steadily, with measured circular motions of the pestle. Allowing the resin to break down gradually, the powder accumulates, deepening in the mortar, and one pauses periodically to gather it together with the spatula, ensuring that all the material is ground to the same degree of fineness. Another common method of preparation is maceration in alcohol. Dragon's blood is soluble to a degree in strong spirits, in what we call spiritus vini, wine spirit, or aqua vitae. When resin is placed in alcohol and allowed to stand for some period of time, days or weeks, depending upon the fineness of the resin and the strength of the spirit, the soluble components gradually dissolve. This process yields a tincture, a liquid preparation that retains the medicinal virtues of the resin in a form that is often more convenient for administration. The tincture may be given by drops, measured precisely. It may be diluted in water or in wine for the patient to drink. It may be applied externally to wounds or to inflamed tissues. The preparation of a tincture follows a certain method. One takes a quantity of dragon's blood, let us say 1 ounce by weight, and places it in a glass vessel. If the resin is in tears or lumps, it is often beneficial to break it into smaller pieces first, or even to grind it coarsely, as this exposes more surface area to the action of the alcohol. Then one adds the spirit, perhaps 8 ounces, perhaps 10. Depending upon the strength of tincture one desires to produce. The vessel is then stoppered and set aside in a location neither too warm nor too cool. Each day or every few days one shakes the vessel gently, encouraging the dissolution of the resin. Gradually the spirit takes on the deep red color of the dragon's blood. The liquid becomes increasingly dark, increasingly rich in hue, until it resembles red wine of great depth, or perhaps blood itself when held to the light. After sufficient time has passed, and here experience must guide the apothecary, for different samples of resin require different durations of maceration. The liquid is strained. One pours it through a clean cloth or through paper prepared for filtering, separating the liquid tincture from any undissolved particles. What remains after straining is a clear red liquid, stable and ready for use. These tinctures serve multiple purposes in the apothecary's practice. They are used, certainly, for their medicinal properties. The astringent and healing virtues of the dragon's blood are preserved in the alcoholic solution, but they are also employed to impart color to other medicines. A tincture may be added to another preparation to give it a red color, either for aesthetic purposes or to mark it as containing certain ingredients. The red color of dragon's blood is distinctive, recognizable, and it may serve to identify a particular formulation or to make a medicine more visually appealing to the patient. Early medical descriptions. Let us turn now to consider what the medical writers of earlier times have written concerning dragon's blood, the authorities upon whose work we build our present practice. The Greek and Arabic medical writers, those scholars who established the foundations of our healing arts, gave attention to dragon's blood in their texts. Dioscorides, a Greek physician of the 1st century, whose work in Materia Medica remains a cornerstone of our knowledge, described dragon's blood among the many substances he catalogued. Dioscorides, you understand, traveled widely in his capacity as a physician to the Roman army. He observed plants and drugs in many lands, compiled his observations with care, and set them down in writing for the benefit of those who would come after. In his discussion of dragon's blood, he noted its use as a medicine for respiratory complaints and for problems of the gastrointestinal tract. Respiratory complaints, that is to say, afflictions of the lungs, the throat, the passages through which we draw breath. Dragon's blood was administered according to these early authorities for coughs that persisted long after their initial cause had passed, for bleeding from the lungs, which sometimes occurs in cases of consumption or after violent coughing, for inflammation of the throat that makes swallowing difficult. The rationale, as these writers understood it, lay in the astringent properties of the resin. An astringent, as I have noted before, causes tissues to contract, to tighten, In the case of respiratory complaints, this action might reduce inflammation, might help seal small wounds in the delicate membranes of the throat and lungs, might reduce the production of excessive phlegm. Gastrointestinal problems formed another category of complaints for which dragon's blood was recommended. These are afflictions of the stomach, of the bowels, of the organs involved in digestion and in the elimination of waste. The Greek and Arabic writers described its use for various forms of flux, that is, excessive discharge from the bowels, and for internal bleeding of the digestive organs. The Arabic medical writers, building upon the Greek foundations and adding their own observations and traditions, continued to employ dragon's blood in their practice. The great physicians of the Islamic world, men such as Ibn Sina, known in Latin as Avicenna, and Al-Razi, called Razis, included dragon's blood in their pharmacopoeias. They refined the understanding of its applications, specified doses, described methods of preparation. These Arabic texts eventually made their way to Europe, translated into Latin, where they profoundly influenced the development of European medicine in the medieval and Renaissance periods. We apothecaries of the present day, whether we always recognize it or not, work within a tradition shaped by both Greek and Arabic learning. In the folk medicine of Yemen and of Socotra, those lands from which much of the ancient dragon's blood originated, the resin held an even broader place in the healing arts, it was considered. According to accounts that have reached us, something of a cure-all, a universal remedy, if you will, applicable to a wide range of ailments. Now, we must approach such claims with appropriate caution. The notion of a universal remedy, a panacea that cures all ills, is more often hope than reality. Yet the breadth of applications for which dragon's blood was employed in these traditional systems does speak to its perceived value, to the trust which local healers placed in its efficacy. The uses documented in these folk traditions include wound healing, the direct application of powdered resin or of resin dissolved in oil or fat, to cuts, to scrapes, to deeper injuries. The astringent action would help stanch bleeding, as I have mentioned. But more than this, the resin was believed to promote the healing of the wound itself, to prevent corruption, to encourage the formation of healthy new flesh. Diarrhea and dysentery, these conditions which involve frequent and often painful elimination of loose or bloody stools, were treated with dragon's blood taken internally. A small quantity of the powdered resin, mixed into water or into some other liquid, would be administered to the patient. The astringent properties would, in theory, tighten the tissues of the bowel, reduce inflammation, help restore normal function. Dysentery, I should note, is a particularly serious condition. It involves not merely loose stools, but often the passage of blood and mucus, accompanied by severe cramping and fever. It has carried off many lives, particularly in hot climates where contamination of water is common. The use of dragon's blood for such a grave complaint indicates the degree of trust placed in this remedy. Fevers, too, fell within the purview of dragon's blood in these traditional practices. Fever, that elevation of the body's heat which accompanies so many diseases, was treated with various preparations of the resin. The precise mechanism by which dragon's blood might reduce fever was not clearly understood. The medical theories of the time spoke in terms of balancing humors, of cooling excessive heat. But the practical observation that it sometimes helped was sufficient to ensure its continued use. Ulcers, those persistent sores, whether on the skin or internally in the stomach or bowels, were another indication for dragon's blood. The resin might be applied directly to external ulcers, or taken internally for those ulcers of the stomach or intestines which cannot be directly reached. The goal was to promote healing, to reduce the weeping discharge that characterizes many ulcers, to allow the damaged tissue to regenerate. Skin disorders formed yet another category of applications. Conditions such as eczema, where the skin becomes inflamed, itchy, perhaps cracked or weeping, were treated with preparations of dragon's blood. The resin might be incorporated into an ointment, mixed with lard or with oil and beeswax. and then applied to the affected areas of skin. Eczema, as those familiar with it know, is a most troublesome condition. The itching can be severe, driving the sufferer to scratch until the skin bleeds. The appearance is distressing. The discomfort interferes with sleep, with work, with the ordinary conduct of life. Any substance that offers relief from such condition would naturally be valued. Thus we see that dragon's blood, in the writings of the Greek and Arabic authorities and in the folk traditions of various peoples, occupied a place of considerable importance in the materia medica. It was not a mere curiosity, not simply a coloring agent. It was a medicine relied upon for a range of serious complaints, a substance in which healers placed genuine confidence. European apothecary practice. I must now speak of the place which dragon's blood held in European apothecary practice, in the work carried out by men of my own profession, in establishments not unlike this one, in which I have labored these many years, the European herbalists, those scholars who compiled great volumes documenting the plants and substances used in medicine, gave careful attention to dragon's blood in their writings. I speak here of men such as John Gerard, whose herbal appeared in the final years of the 16th century, and John Parkinson, who published his Theatrum Botanicum some decades later in the 17th century. These were learned men, you understand. They read Latin and Greek, consulted the ancient authorities, but also made their own observations and recorded the practices of their contemporaries. Their work served as references for apothecaries and physicians, providing descriptions of substances, their origins, their preparations, and their medicinal uses. Gerard and Parkinson both recorded the use of dragon's blood for bleeding disorders. These are conditions in which the blood flows too freely, either from wounds or from internal sources. The hemorrhages, as they are termed in the learned language, may be external, from cuts or injuries that can be seen and dressed, or internal, which present greater difficulty in treatment. The astringent nature of dragon's blood, that quality which causes tissues to contract and tighten, made it a logical choice for such complaints. When bleeding occurs, whether from a wound upon the skin or from some internal organ, the stanching of that flow is of paramount importance. A patient can ill afford to lose excessive quantities of blood. The body weakens, the pulse grows faint, the complexion becomes pale, and if the bleeding continues unchecked, death may follow. Dragon's blood applied externally to a bleeding wound in powdered form or incorporated into a styptic preparation would help arrest the flow. Taken internally as a powder or tincture, it was believed to exert a similar effect upon internal bleeding, though how precisely it might reach an effect, say a bleeding vessel in the stomach or lungs, was a matter of some theoretical debate. Internal complaints of various sorts also fell within the scope of dragon's blood's applications, as recorded by these herbalists. The term internal complaints encompasses a broad range of afflictions, difficulties of the stomach, of the bowels, of the organs of generation and elimination, of the chest and lungs. The specific conditions for which dragon's blood was prescribed by European practitioners included menorrhagia. This is the medical term for excessive monthly bleeding in women, that regular occurrence which, in some unfortunate women, becomes too profuse, too prolonged, causing weakness and distress. The normal course of nature becomes, in such cases, a burden. The blood flows too freely, continues too many days, and the woman suffers for it. For menorrhagia, dragon's blood was administered internally. A measured dose of the powdered resin, or a specified number of drops of the tincture, would be given daily during the time of the monthly flow. The expectation was that the astringent properties would reduce the excessive discharge, restore it to more normal proportions, and thus preserve the woman's strength. Dysentery, that serious affliction of the bowels, which I have mentioned before, remained a significant indication for dragon's blood in European practice, as it had been in earlier Arabic and folk traditions. The disease involves frequent, painful evacuations, often with blood and mucus, accompanied by fever and severe cramping. It is most common in warm weather, when contamination of food and water occurs more readily, and it has carried off many lives in epidemics. The treatment with dragon's blood followed established principles. The astringent would tighten the inflamed tissues of the bowel, reduce the excessive secretion of fluids, help restore normal function. It would typically be given in combination with other remedies, perhaps with opiates to reduce the pain and cramping, with gentle demulcents to soothe the irritated tissues, with careful attention to the patient's diet. Spitting of blood, or hemoptysis, as it is termed in medical Latin, formed another indication. This is a condition in which blood appears in the matter coughed up from the lungs. It may occur in consumption, that wasting disease of the lungs, which we also call phthisis, or after violent coughing, or in certain other diseases of the chest. The appearance of blood in what one coughs up is always a grave sign. It indicates damage to the delicate tissues of the lungs or the passages leading to them. Treatment with dragon's blood aimed to seal these small injuries. To reduce the bleeding, to allow healing to occur, it would be administered as a tincture, often in a syrup or other pleasant medium, to make it easier to swallow and to soothe the throat. Loose teeth presented yet another application for dragon's blood. And when the gums become diseased, inflamed, or weakened, whether from scurvy, from age, from poor nutrition, or from other causes, the teeth may begin to loosen in their sockets. This is both uncomfortable and alarming, for the loss of teeth greatly impairs one's ability to eat and speaks of declining health. Dragon's blood would be applied directly to the gums as a powder or as a tincture diluted somewhat and used as a mouth rinse. The astringent effect would tighten the gum tissue, reduce any bleeding or seepage, and it was hoped to help secure the teeth more firmly. Whether this treatment truly preserved teeth that would otherwise have been lost is difficult to say with certainty. But it was believed to offer benefit. Urinary issues, problems with the passing of water, or the presence of blood in the urine, or excessive frequency of urination, also came within the range of conditions treated with dragon's blood. The urinary tract from the kidneys through the bladder to the passage by which urine is voided may be afflicted by various disorders. Inflammation, stones, bleeding, weakness of the bladder, all these and more might trouble a patient. For such complaints, dragon's blood would be taken internally, the expectation being that its astringent virtues would somehow reach and affect the afflicted organs. The precise mechanism by which an orally administered substance might exert specific effects upon, say, the bladder, was not fully understood, but practical experience suggested that certain remedies did indeed help with certain urinary complaints. Minor burns, too, might be treated with dragon's blood when the skin is burned, whether by fire, by hot liquid, by excessive sun, or by other means. The tissue is damaged. There may be redness, swelling, blistering, pain. If the burn is minor, affecting only the surface of the skin over a limited area, it will generally heal without great difficulty, though with discomfort during the healing period. Dragon's blood might be incorporated into an ointment or salve for application to such burns. The astringent effect could reduce weeping from the burned tissue, and there was belief that it would promote healing and reduce the likelihood of corruption or festering. The resin's red color would, of course, make the treated area quite distinctive in appearance, but this was of little concern compared to the goal of healing. The reputation of dragon's blood in European apothecary practice rested, as these herbalists made clear largely upon its astringent qualities. This was the property that united its various applications, whether for bleeding, for excessive discharges, for loose tissues that needed tightening, for inflamed areas that required reduction of swelling and seepage. An astringent, in the understanding of the time, worked by its very nature to contract, to bind, to dry. These effects could be beneficial in many circumstances. Excessive flow of fluids, whether blood or other secretions, could be checked. Loose or swollen tissues could be firmed. Wounds could be sealed more readily. Of course, an astringent used to excess or in inappropriate circumstances might cause its own problems. Tissues dried too much, contracted too forcefully, might lose their proper function, but employed judiciously in appropriate cases and in measured doses, The astringent virtues of dragon's blood were considered valuable indeed. Hospital and formal medicine. Let me speak now of dragon's blood's place in more formal medical institutions. In the hospitals and organized medical establishments where physicians of recognized standing practiced their art, dragon's blood formed a standard part of the formal hospital materia medica in Britain during the 18th and 19th centuries. By formal hospital materia medica, I mean the established list of medicines kept in stock, recognized as useful, prescribed by physicians, as a matter of regular practice, rather than as an exotic or experimental remedy. This distinction is important. Many substances circulate in popular medicine, in folk traditions, recommended by this or that healer, but not accepted by the established medical profession. Dragon's blood, however, had moved beyond this status. It was accepted, stocked in hospital pharmacies, prescribed by physicians, trained at universities, included in the official lists. The 18th century saw great developments in hospital medicine in Britain. Institutions such as St. Bartholomew's Hospital, St. Thomas's Hospital, Guy's Hospital in London, and similar establishments in other cities became centers of medical practice and teaching. These hospitals maintained pharmacies where medicines were prepared and dispensed under the supervision of apothecaries, following the prescriptions written by attending physicians. Dragon's blood held its place in these hospital pharmacies. It would be kept in stock, properly stored to maintain its quality, ready for use when prescribed. The hospital apothecary would prepare it as needed, grinding it to powder, making tinctures, incorporating it into various compound medicines according to established formulas. The association of dragon's blood with prominent physicians of the period lends further weight to its acceptance in formal medicine. I speak here of men such as Richard Mead, a physician of great reputation in London during the early 18th century. Mead served as physician to King George II, held appointments at St. Thomas's Hospital, and was recognized as one of the leading medical authorities of his time. Richard Mead's name appearing in connection with dragon's blood, whether in his prescriptions, in his writings, or in the hospital formulas with which he was associated, indicates that this was not a remedy relegated to the margins of practice. It was employed by physicians at the very center of the medical establishment, men whose judgment was trusted, whose practices were emulated by others. The 19th century continued this acceptance. Dragon's blood remained in use in hospitals, in dispensaries, in the practices of regular physicians. It appeared in pharmacopoeias, those official books which list and standardize medicines published in various countries. The preparations, the doses, the indications were set down in formal terms, giving guidance to practitioners. Evidence of this continued use extends even to our own colonies. I have learned of an apothecary jar held in the collections of Museums Victoria. That is to say, in Australia, that distant land to which Britain has sent colonists, and I regret to say, convicts. This particular jar is labeled for dragon's blood and dates to approximately the year 1900. That is to say, at the very turning of the century, as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, dragon's blood was still in active pharmaceutical use. This jar comes from a mental health hospital pharmacy, a facility for the treatment of those suffering from disorders of the mind, melancholy, mania, and related afflictions. Now, one might wonder what use dragon's blood would have in such an institution. Mental disorders do not, on the face of it, seem to call for an astringent remedy. However, we must remember that hospital pharmacies stocked medicines for all the physical ailments that might afflict patients, not only treatments specific to their primary condition. A patient in a mental health hospital might still suffer from dysentery, from bleeding, from wounds, from any of the various physical complaints common to humanity. The presence of dragon's blood in such a pharmacy, properly labeled in a pharmaceutical jar as part of the regular stock, indicates that it was considered a standard pharmaceutical. It was not merely a folk remedy, not something used only by the uneducated or those without access to regular medical care. It was part of the formal medical system, part of the apparatus of institutional medicine. This apothecary jar, preserved now in a museum collection, serves as a tangible link to the past practices of our profession. One can imagine it sitting on a shelf in the hospital pharmacy, alongside jars of other substances, some familiar to us, some perhaps now forgotten. The apothecary or pharmacist would reach for it when needed, measure out the required quantity, prepare it as directed by the physician's prescription. The label on such a jar would have been written clearly. In a practiced hand, or perhaps printed, it would state simply dragon's blood, or perhaps the Latin form, sanguis draconis. Perhaps there would be additional information, the source, the grade, the date of receipt. These details mattered for ensuring that medicines were fresh, that they maintained their potency, that they were what they purported to be. The fact that this particular jar comes from the year 1900, the beginning of the 20th century, is significant. By that time, many traditional remedies were beginning to fall out of favor. New discoveries in chemistry, in pharmacology, in understanding of disease were transforming medical practice. Synthetic drugs were beginning to appear. The reliance on plant and animal products, on ancient remedies, was diminishing, yet dragon's blood remained. It held its place even as the medical world changed around it. This persistence speaks to a continued belief in its utility, a continued satisfaction with its effects. Physicians and pharmacists who had newer options available to them, nonetheless, still prescribed and dispensed dragon's blood. Of course, we must also acknowledge that medical practice changes slowly. Remedies that have been used for generations, that appear in the textbooks, that are familiar and trusted, do not disappear overnight simply because new discoveries are made. There's a natural conservatism in medicine, a caution about abandoning what has seemed to work in favor of the untried and new. Still, for dragon's blood to maintain its place into the 20th century, in a formal hospital setting, in a colonial institution, trying to maintain the standards of metropolitan medicine, this indicates that it was more than mere tradition. It was valued. It was believed to be effective. It was part of the standard practice of the healing arts as they were understood at that time. Compounded preparations, having discussed dragon's blood as a simple, that is to say, as a single substance used on its own, I must now address its role in compounded preparations. These are medicines composed of multiple ingredients, combined according to established formulas, each component contributing its particular virtues to the whole dragon's blood, appeared frequently in such compound recipes, listed alongside other substances drawn from the three kingdoms of nature, the vegetable, the animal, and the mineral. It would be found in formulas that included various gums and resins drawn from other trees, aromatics such as frankincense and fats rendered from animals, beeswax gathered from the hives, and even certain metals prepared in forms suitable for medicinal use. The art of compounding medicines is a central aspect of the apothecary's craft. One must know not only the individual virtues of each substance, but how they interact when combined, how they are best incorporated together, in what proportions they should be mixed to achieve the desired effect. A compound medicine is not simply a collection of ingredients thrown together haphazardly. It is rather a carefully constructed preparation in which each element has its purpose. Dragon's blood found its place, particularly in preparations intended for external application. That is to say, medicines applied to the surface of the body, rather than taken internally. These external preparations take various forms, and dragon's blood was incorporated into several of them. Plasters formed one important category. A plaster, in the pharmaceutical sense, is a preparation of a consistency somewhat firmer than an ointment, designed to be spread upon cloth or leather and then applied to the body. Where it adheres and exerts its medicinal action over an extended period, plasters might remain in place for hours or even days, slowly releasing their active components into the affected tissues. The creation of a plaster involves melting together various ingredients, typically including fats or oils, waxes to provide firmness, resins for their medicinal properties, and often powdered substances such as metallic oxides or ground herbs. Dragon's blood, being a resin, would be incorporated during the melting process, contributing both its astringent virtues and its distinctive red color to the final preparation. These plasters containing dragon's blood were prescribed for various conditions. Ulcers, those persistent sores which I have mentioned before, might be dressed with such a plaster. The astringent action would help reduce the weeping discharge characteristic of many ulcers, while the protective covering of the plaster would keep the wound clean and promote healing. Hemorrhoids, those swollen and often painful veins in the lower bowel, represented another indication for plasters containing dragon's blood. Hemorrhoids may bleed, may cause great discomfort in sitting or in the passage of stools. A plaster applied to the affected area would provide the astringent effect needed to reduce swelling and bleeding, while the protective coating would ease the friction that aggravates the condition. Fractures and sprains of the limbs also fell within the range of conditions treated with plasters containing dragon's blood. Now, you may wonder what benefit an astringent resin could provide for a broken bone or a wrenched joint. The answer lies in understanding that these injuries involve not only damage to the bone or joint itself, but also injury to the surrounding soft tissues. When a bone breaks, the flesh around it swells, bruises becomes inflamed. When a joint is sprained, the ligaments stretched or torn, similar swelling and inflammation occur. A plaster applied over such an injury, once any necessary setting or binding has been accomplished, would help reduce the swelling, ease the pain, and support the healing of the soft tissues, even as the bone or ligament healed beneath. Joint complaints of a more chronic nature, the aches and stiffness that afflict many persons as they advance in years, or the pain that settles in joints subjected to excessive labor, or to the damp cold of our climate, these too might be treated with plasters containing dragon's blood. Whether the astringent resin truly penetrated deep enough to affect the joint itself is questionable, but the warmth of the plaster, the slight counter-irritation it provided, and perhaps some absorption of active components through the skin, all contributed to a sense of relief. Ointments and salves represent another category of external preparations into which dragon's blood was incorporated. These are softer than plasters, designed to be rubbed onto the skin rather than applied on cloth. An ointment typically consists of fats or oils mixed with powdered or dissolved medicinal substances, creating a smooth preparation that melts at body temperature and can be easily spread. The preparation of an ointment containing dragon's blood would proceed as follows. One would first warm the fat or oil base, perhaps lard olive oil, perhaps a mixture of several fats chosen for their particular properties. To this warmed base, one would add the dragon's blood, either finely powdered or dissolved in a small quantity of alcohol. The mixture would be stirred thoroughly, ensuring complete distribution of the resin throughout the fatty base. As the mixture cooled, it would solidify into a smooth ointment, red tinted from the dragon's blood, ready to be stored in a suitable container, typically a glazed earthenware pot or a glass jar. Such an ointment might be prescribed for application to wounds, to sores, to areas of inflamed skin, to hemorrhoids, as I mentioned earlier, or to any condition where the astringent and healing properties of dragon's blood were desired. Beyond these preparations for obvious wounds and injuries, dragon's blood appeared in various other pharmaceutical forms. It was used in pill coatings, for instance. Pills, those small, rounded doses of medicine designed to be swallowed whole, were often coated with various substances to make them easier to swallow, to protect the contents from air and moisture, or simply to make them more attractive in appearance. The coating containing dragon's blood would impart a red color to the pills, making them distinctive. easily identified as belonging to a particular formula. The coating might be applied by rolling the pills in a powder containing dragon's blood, or by dipping them in a solution and allowing them to dry. The result would be pills of a pleasing red hue, their surface smooth and glossy. Tooth powders represented another application. These are powders designed to be applied to the teeth and gums for cleansing, and for treating various oral complaints. A tooth powder might contain abrasive materials to help remove deposits from the teeth, aromatic substances to freshen the breath, and medicinal components to address issues such as bleeding gums or loose teeth. Dragon's blood, with its astringent properties, would help tighten the gums, reduce bleeding, and, so it was believed, help secure teeth that had begun to loosen. The powder would be applied to the teeth and gums with a finger or with a small brush, rubbed gently, and then rinsed away. Regular use was said to maintain the health of the mouth. Mouth preparations of other sorts also employed dragon's blood, gargles for sore throats, mouth rinses for ulcers or inflammation of the mouth. Even lozenges designed to be slowly dissolved in the mouth all might contain dragon's blood among their ingredients. The astringent effect was valued for reducing inflammation and pain. While the red color served to identify these preparations, the incorporation of dragon's blood into these various compounded preparations demonstrates its versatility, its acceptance as a standard pharmaceutical agent, useful in many contexts. It was not reserved for a single type of medicine or a single category of complaint, but rather appeared across the range of the apothecaries' formulations. Color, craft, and non-medical use. I must now turn to a different aspect of dragon's blood. Its applications beyond the realm of medicine, in the spheres of craft, of art, of personal adornment. For this substance, valued, though it was for its healing properties, possessed qualities that recommended it for other purposes as well. The most obvious of these qualities is its color. Dragon's blood, as I have repeatedly noted, exhibits a deep, rich red hue of remarkable intensity. This color, when properly extracted and applied, proves fast. That is to say, it does not readily fade or wash away. Such a color naturally attracted the attention of dyers, and of those who worked with pigments. Dragon's blood was used as a dye for textiles, for cloth of various sorts, from fine silks to coarser woolens. The dyeing process would involve dissolving or suspending the resin in an appropriate medium, perhaps alcohol, perhaps lye, and then immersing the textile in this dye bath. The fibers would absorb the color, emerging with a red tint that ranged from bright scarlet to deeper crimson, depending upon the concentration of the dye and the duration of immersion. This red was not, perhaps, as brilliant as that obtained from certain other dye sources. Cochineal, for instance, that insect-derived dye from the Americas, produces an exceptionally vivid red. Nor was it as color-fast as some other dyes. But dragon's blood offered a serviceable red at a reasonable cost, and it found its place in the dyer's repertoire of materials. In pottery, dragon's blood served as a pigment for decoration. The resin could be incorporated into glazes, or applied to the surface of ceramic wares before firing. The heat of the kiln would fix the color, creating decorative patterns or overall tints of red. The exact shade produced depended upon the composition of the clay, the other materials in the glaze, and the temperature and atmosphere of firing variables which the skilled potter learned to control through experience. Cosmetics represented yet another application for this versatile resin. Women have long sought to enhance their appearance through the application of colors to the face, and red has traditionally been valued for the lips. Dragon's blood, being both intensely colored and relatively safe for application to the skin, served as an ingredient in preparations for coloring the lips. Such a cosmetic might be prepared by mixing finely powdered dragon's blood with a fat or oil base, perhaps almond oil, perhaps a refined lard, creating a red salve that could be applied to the lips with the finger. The result would be lips of a reddened hue, the exact shade depending upon the concentration of the resin and the natural color of the wearer's lips. Whether such cosmetic use was entirely respectable is a matter that varied with time and place. In some periods and in some societies, the painting of one's face was associated with women of questionable virtue, In other times, it was more widely accepted among respectable women, but regardless of social attitudes, the practice continued. And dragon's blood found its place among the materials employed. I must speak now of a particularly refined application of dragon's blood, its use by the violin makers of Italy in the 18th century. These craftsmen, working in cities such as Cremona, produced string instruments of extraordinary quality. Instruments that are valued to this day, centuries after their creation, as among the finest ever made. The makers of these violins, men such as Antonio Stradivari, whose name has become synonymous with excellence in instrument making, paid meticulous attention to every aspect of their craft. The selection of wood, the shaping of each piece, the precise graduation of thickness, the placement of the sound post, all received careful consideration, and not least among their concerns was the varnish applied to the finished instrument. The varnish served multiple purposes. It protected the wood from moisture, from handling, from the various insults that a musical instrument endures over its lifetime of use. It enhanced the beauty of the wood, bringing out the grain, adding luster, and though this remains a matter of some debate among those who study such things, it may have influenced the sound, affecting how the wood vibrates, how it responds to the bow. These Italian masters developed varnish formulas which they guarded carefully, passing them within families or to trusted apprentices, but not broadcasting them to the world. Many of these formulas have been lost. We know from analysis of surviving instruments and from fragments of recipes that have come down to us that dragon's blood was among the ingredients employed. The resin would have been dissolved in alcohol or in oil, mixed with other resins and with oils, and perhaps with small amounts of pigments or drying agents. The resulting varnish would possess that warm red-brown tone so characteristic of these fine instruments, applied in thin layers, allowed to dry between coats, built up gradually over weeks or months. This varnish would create that glowing, almost three-dimensional finish that we observe on these violins. Whether dragon's blood was essential to this effect, or whether it was simply one option among several that might have been used, is difficult to determine at this remove in time. What is certain is that skilled craftsmen, working at the highest level of their art, found dragon's blood useful. They incorporated it into preparations whose results have not been equaled, let alone surpassed, in the centuries since, by the early 20th century, that period I mentioned earlier when discussing the apothecary jar from Australia. The role of dragon's blood in pharmacy had begun to shift. Medical texts of that period note that its use was mainly as a coloring agent rather than as an active medicinal ingredient. This represents a significant change, where once dragon's blood was valued primarily for its therapeutic properties. With its coloring ability a secondary consideration, now the color had become primary. It was added to medicines not for its astringent effect, but simply to tint them red, to make them visually distinctive or aesthetically pleasing. This shift reflects broader changes in medicine and pharmacy during that period, as understanding of disease and of drug action became more scientific, as synthetic chemicals began to replace natural products. Many traditional remedies fell from favor. They were not necessarily proven ineffective. Often they simply were not tested by the new scientific methods. They were old-fashioned, associated with an earlier era of medicine, and they gradually gave way to newer preparations. Dragon's blood, it seems, made this transition from active ingredient to mere coloring agent during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It retained a place in pharmacy, but a diminished one, valued now for appearance rather than for action. It was a quiet ending to centuries of medical use, a fading rather than a sudden disappearance. Ritual and symbolic uses I must now speak, though with some hesitation, of uses for dragon's blood that lie outside the ordinary bounds of medicine and craft. These are applications in the realm of ritual, of what some term magic, of practices that occupy a space between religion and folklore. Dragon's blood has appeared, you understand, in ritual incense, that is to say, in mixtures of aromatic substances, burned to produce fragrant smoke during ceremonies of various sorts. The smoke rises, carrying with it the scent of the burning materials, and is believed by those who employ such practices to possess certain effects beyond the merely physical. The use of incense in religious and ceremonial contexts is ancient, stretching back beyond recorded history. Frankincense and myrrh, those resins from Arabia, have been burned in temples and churches for millennia. Dragon's blood, with its own resinous character and its deep red color, found a place among the substances employed for such purposes. When dragon's blood is placed upon hot coals, it melts, bubbles, releases its smoke. The scent is distinctive, resinous certainly, with a slightly sweet character, not unpleasant to most who smell it. The smoke itself carries that red tint, visible when the light catches it properly, creating an effect that those inclined towards symbolism find meaningful. In certain traditions of magical practice, and here I speak carefully, for these are matters about which there is much superstition and no small degree of deception, dragon's blood holds a particular place. It is associated with protection, with purification, with the warding off of harmful influences. Whether there is any truth to such associations, whether the burning of dragon's blood resin actually accomplishes anything beyond the production of scented smoke, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that people believe these things, and belief itself exerts a powerful influence upon human affairs. A person who feels protected, who trusts that they have taken effective measures against misfortune, may move through the world with greater confidence. Whether the protection is real or imagined matters less, perhaps, than the effect such belief has upon the person's conduct and state of mind. I have learned that dragon's blood features in African American folk magic, those practices brought from Africa and transformed in the Americas, mixing with European and indigenous traditions, to create something distinctive. In these practices, dragon's blood serves purposes related to cleansing and to what is termed charm work. Cleansing, in this context, refers to the removal of negative influences, of bad luck, of spiritual contamination, however conceived. The resin might be burned as incense, added to washing water, incorporated into preparations applied to the body or to objects. The intent is to purify, to remove that which is undesired, to restore a state of cleanness or neutrality. Charm work involves the creation of objects believed to possess particular powers or to influence events in desired ways. These might be small packets of materials sewn into cloth, objects inscribed with symbols or words, mixtures of various substances combined according to traditional formulas. Dragon's blood appears as an ingredient in such charms, valued for its color, for its traditional associations, for its rarity. There exists, or so I am informed, a preparation known as dragon's blood ink. This is not ink for ordinary writing, for the keeping of accounts, or the penning of letters. Rather, it is ink prepared specifically for the inscription of charms, of talismans, of written spells or prayers believed to possess efficacy beyond their literal meaning. The preparation of such an ink would involve dissolving dragon's blood resin in alcohol or in another suitable solvent, perhaps adding gum arabic to give the proper consistency, perhaps incorporating other ingredients according to the specific tradition or the intended purpose of the ink. The resulting liquid would be deeply red, suitable for writing upon parchment or upon paper. The inscriptions made with this ink might be words of protection, symbols from various traditions, names of spirits or of saints, verses from sacred texts. Once written, the inscribed material might be worn upon the person, placed in a specific location, buried, burned, or otherwise employed according to the requirements of the ritual. The use of dragon's blood ink, specifically rather than ordinary ink, is believed to enhance the power or efficacy of the inscription. I speak of these matters with some detachment. You understand, as an apothecary, my concern is primarily with the physical properties of substances, with their effects upon the body in health and disease. The realm of ritual and magic lies somewhat outside my expertise. I report what I have learned, what is practiced. without claiming to judge the truth or falsity of the beliefs involved. It is worth noting that the line between medicine and magic has not always been as clear as we might now suppose. In earlier times, the two were often intertwined. A remedy might be administered with particular words spoken over it, at particular phases of the moon with attention to astrological considerations. The physical and the spiritual were understood to interact, to influence one another. Our modern practice attempts to separate these elements, to rely upon the physical properties of medicines alone, without recourse to ritual or incantation. Yet old beliefs persist, old practices continue, particularly among common folk who lack access to regular medical care, or who maintain traditions passed down through generations. Dragon's blood, with its striking appearance, its exotic origin, its long history of use, naturally attracted such beliefs and practices. The very name suggests something beyond the ordinary, something touched by legend. It is perhaps not surprising that it should find a place in rituals, in practices that seek to work upon the world through means other than the purely physical changing medical status. Let me turn now to the gradual transformation of dragon's blood's place in medical practice, a change that occurred over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. By the early years of the 20th century, the internal use of dragon's blood, that is to say, taking it by mouth for the treatment of internal complaints, had notably declined. Where once it would have been routinely prescribed for dysentery, for internal bleeding, for excessive monthly flows, physicians were now more reluctant to recommend its internal administration. This change reflected several developments in medical understanding, new knowledge of anatomy and physiology, new understanding of disease processes, new treatments based on scientific research rather than on traditional practice. All these contributed to a re-evaluation of older remedies. Margaret Grieve, a notable herbalist and author whose work on medicinal plants appeared in the early 20th century, recorded in her writings that dragon's blood was by her time. Now never given internally. This is a remarkable statement when one considers the long history of internal use, the many centuries during which dragon's blood was routinely administered for internal complaints. Now never given internally. The words suggest a complete reversal, a wholesale abandonment of what had been standard practice. In the space of a few decades, dragon's blood had gone from being a medicine taken by mouth for serious internal conditions to something that physicians would not prescribe for such use at all. What accounts for this change? Several factors, I believe, contributed to this shift in medical practice. First, there was the matter of efficacy. As medical science developed more rigorous methods for evaluating treatments, many traditional remedies were found to be less effective than had been believed. Sometimes they provided no benefit beyond what might be attributed to the natural course of disease or to the patient's expectation of improvement. Dragon's blood, when subjected to such scrutiny, may have been found wanting. Second, there was the matter of safety. Medical caution regarding the internal use of dragon's blood increased as physicians became more aware of potential complications and adverse effects. The very astringent properties that had once been valued came to be seen as potentially problematic. Consider the case of pregnancy. Pregnant women are, quite rightly, a matter of particular medical concern. Anything that might affect the course of pregnancy, that might harm the developing child or endanger the mother, must be approached with extreme caution. Astringent substances that cause tissues to contract, could theoretically affect the womb, perhaps stimulating contractions at an inappropriate time. While there may not have been clear evidence that dragon's blood actually caused miscarriage or premature labor, the possibility was sufficient to recommend caution. As medical thinking became more conservative, more inclined to avoid any unnecessary risk, remedies with even potential hazards during pregnancy fell from favor for use in expectant mothers. Bleeding disorders presented another area of concern. Now, this may seem paradoxical. Dragon's blood was traditionally used to stop bleeding. So why would it be contraindicated in bleeding disorders? The answer lies in a more sophisticated understanding of how blood clotting works and what can go wrong with that process. Some bleeding disorders involve problems with the blood vessels themselves, others with the clotting factors in the blood, still others with the platelets that help form clots. An astringent that simply contracts tissues might not address the underlying problem, and might even complicate the picture by masking symptoms or by interacting in unexpected ways with the body's clotting mechanisms. As physicians gained better understanding of these disorders and developed more specific treatments, the use of a general astringent like dragon's blood came to seem crude, insufficiently targeted. Why use a substance whose mechanism of action was poorly understood when more specific treatments were becoming available? Long-term safety formed yet another concern. What happens when a substance is taken repeatedly over extended periods? Might it accumulate in the body? Might it cause damage that only becomes apparent after prolonged use? These questions became more pressing as medicine adopted a more cautious stance. With dragon's blood, there was little systematic knowledge of its long-term effects. It had been used for centuries, certainly, but that traditional use did not constitute the kind of careful documentation and follow-up that modern medical practice demanded. Without clear evidence of long-term safety, without studies tracking patients who took dragon's blood for extended periods, physicians grew reluctant to prescribe it for chronic conditions. The decline in internal use did not necessarily mean that dragon's blood disappeared entirely from medical practice. As I noted earlier, it continued to be used externally. In preparations for application to wounds, to skin conditions, to hemorrhoids, external application was judged to carry less risk than internal administration, and so dragon's blood maintained a presence in pharmacy, even as its internal use waned. There is also the matter of professional opinion and fashion in medicine. Just as in other human endeavors, what is considered proper practice in medicine changes over time, influenced not only by new knowledge, but also by the opinions of leading practitioners, by what is taught in medical schools, by what appears in prominent textbooks and journals. As influential physicians moved away from prescribing dragon's blood internally, as it ceased to be taught to medical students as a useful internal remedy, as newer treatments were promoted in its place, the practice of internal administration gradually died out. A remedy not prescribed by one generation of physicians is unknown to the next generation, and so traditions end not with a dramatic rejection, but with a quiet forgetting. By the middle of the 20th century, dragon's blood had largely passed out of regular medical use in Western countries. It might still appear in some traditional or folk practices, might still be found in herbalist shops, might still be remembered by older practitioners, but in hospitals, in dispensaries, in the practices of physicians trained in modern medical schools, it had become a curiosity, a relic of earlier times, something discussed more in historical context than as a current therapeutic option. This represents, I suppose, the natural progression of medical knowledge. Old remedies give way to new ones. Traditional practices yield to scientific medicine. Yet in this progression, something is perhaps also lost. The accumulated practical wisdom of centuries of use, the careful observations of countless practitioners who employed these substances and noted their effects. Whether dragon's blood truly possessed all the virtues attributed to it, or whether its reputation exceeded its actual therapeutic value, I cannot say with absolute certainty from this vantage point. What I can say is that for many centuries it was valued, it was used, it was believed to help, and that in itself is worthy of note. Chemistry and material nature, I must now speak of dragon's blood in terms of its material composition, its chemical nature, matters which have been elucidated in more recent times through methods of investigation that were not available to apothecaries of earlier generations. We spoke of dragon's blood as a resin, and indeed it is. But botanists and chemists who have studied its composition inform us that it should more precisely be classified as a phenolic resin, rather than as a simple sap. This distinction, while it may seem a mere refinement of terminology, actually tells us something important about the substance's nature and properties. A phenolic resin is one that contains phenolic compounds, that is to say, molecules built around a particular chemical structure involving what the chemists term a phenol group. These compounds possess certain characteristic properties. They tend to be astringent, as we have noted dragon's blood to be. They often have antimicrobial effects, acting against bacteria and fungi. They may serve as antioxidants, preventing certain types of chemical degradation. The composition of dragon's blood is not simple. It is not a single pure substance, but rather a complex mixture of many different chemical compounds. This complexity is characteristic of natural products. Substances derived from living organisms tend to contain many components, unlike the pure chemicals that can be isolated in a laboratory or synthesized through chemical processes. Among the components identified in dragon's blood are tannins. These are compounds found widely in the plant kingdom, responsible for the astringent taste of tea, of certain wines, of unripe fruits. Tannins have the property of binding to proteins, causing them to precipitate or to contract. This binding action accounts for much of the astringent effect we observe when tannins are applied to living tissues or consumed. The presence of tannins in dragon's blood helps explain its traditional medicinal uses. When applied to a wound, the tannins would bind to proteins in the exposed tissue, causing contraction, helping to stanch bleeding, creating a kind of temporary seal. When taken internally for diarrhea or dysentery, the tannins would exert a similar astringent effect upon the inflamed tissues of the digestive tract. Flavonoids represent another class of compounds found in dragon's blood. These are pigmented substances. That is to say, they contribute to color, and they also possess various biological activities. Some flavonoids act as antioxidants. Some have anti-inflammatory effects. Some influence the permeability of blood vessels. The specific flavonoids present in dragon's blood and their particular contributions to its medicinal properties have been subjects of scientific investigation. Among the pigments specifically identified in dragon's blood is a compound called Dracaena. The name itself derives from the substance's source, Draco referring to dragon, rodent relating to red color. This compound contributes significantly to the deep red hue that characterizes dragon's blood resin. This is not merely a coloring agent without other properties. However, research has suggested that Dracaena may possess antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory activities of its own. Proanthocyanidins form yet another important class of compounds in dragon's blood. These are complex molecules, polymers built up from simpler units belonging to the broader family of tannins. The name proanthocyanidin indicates that these compounds can be broken down to yield anthocyanidins, which are themselves colored substances found in many red and purple fruits and flowers. The proanthocyanidins can account for a substantial portion of dragon's blood's dry weight. That is to say, if one were to completely dry out a sample of the resin, removing all moisture, a significant fraction of what remained would be proanthocyanidins. This high concentration of these particular compounds likely contributes substantially to the astringent properties and to other biological activities of the resin. When dragon's blood is examined under microscopy, that is when thin sections or powdered samples are viewed through the lenses of a microscope. It reveals a particular structure. The resin does not show the crystalline structure that characterizes many pure chemical substances. Rather, it appears amorphous, without regular geometric order. The texture has been described as coral-like, consisting of irregular masses and branches, creating a complex three-dimensional structure at the microscopic level. This amorphous coral-like structure affects how dragon's blood behaves when one attempts to dissolve it or to process it in various ways. Substances with regular crystalline structures often dissolve predictably at consistent rates. Amorphous substances may dissolve less uniformly, with some portions going into solution more readily than others. This variability might account for some of the differences observers noted between different samples of dragon's blood, even when those samples came from the same botanical source. The solubility of dragon's blood varies depending upon the solvent employed. It is only partially soluble in water. Some components will dissolve, others will not. It is more soluble in alcohol, which is why tinctures prepared with strong spirits were a preferred method of preparation for many medicinal uses. It also shows some solubility in oils and fats, allowing its incorporation into ointments and similar preparations. This chemical complexity, this mixture of tannins, flavonoids, pigments, and other compounds, means that dragon's blood exerts not a single, simple effect, but rather multiple effects simultaneously. The astringent action of the tannins combines with potential antimicrobial effects of various components, with anti-inflammatory properties, with effects on blood vessels, with antioxidant actions. The result is a substance whose overall impact on living tissues is the sum of many individual chemical influences. Modern scientific analysis has thus provided a more detailed understanding of what dragon's blood is at the molecular level, what it contains, how those components might act upon the body. This knowledge both confirms aspects of traditional use. The astringent effects are real, explicable by the presence of tannins, and suggests additional properties that may not have been fully appreciated by earlier practitioners. Yet even with this detailed chemical knowledge, there remains an element of complexity that defies complete reduction to simple formulas. Natural products like dragon's blood contain so many components, present in such varied proportions, interacting with one another in ways that may be synergistic or antagonistic, that a complete account of their action proves challenging even for modern science. The present day, let me speak now of the current status of dragon's blood, of how this ancient substance is regarded and employed in our present time. In the realm of formal medicine, of pharmaceuticals approved by regulatory authorities for specific medical uses, there exists a notable development. A purified extract derived from Croton necleri, that is from one of the croton species that produces dragon's blood resin, has received approval from the Food and Drug Administration in the United States for the treatment of non-infectious diarrhea. This represents a remarkable validation of traditional use. For centuries, dragon's blood was employed for diarrhea and dysentery, for complaints of the bowels involving excessive discharge. Now, in our modern age of scientific medicine, of rigorous testing and regulatory approval, we find that a purified extract from one dragon's blood source has been deemed effective enough and safe enough to warrant official approval. For this very indication, the extract in question is not crude dragon's blood resin as it would have been used by apothecaries of earlier times. It is a purified preparation, standardized to contain specific amounts of active components, tested in clinical trials according to modern protocols. Yet the link to traditional use is clear. The wisdom of generations of healers who employed dragon's blood for diarrhea has in this instance been confirmed by contemporary science. This approval is specifically for non-infectious diarrhea, that is, diarrhea not caused by bacteria or parasites or viruses, but rather by other causes such as irritable bowel syndrome or certain medications or food intolerances. The distinction is important, as infectious diarrhea may require different treatment approaches, perhaps including antimicrobial agents to address the underlying infection beyond this specific approved pharmaceutical use. Dragon's blood continues to be employed in various ways in contemporary commerce and practice. It has not disappeared from use, though its applications have shifted from what they were in earlier centuries. In the realm of incense, dragon's blood maintains a presence. It is sold by suppliers of incense materials, both to those who burn it for its scent alone, and to those who employ it in ritual or ceremonial contexts. The resin is available in its traditional forms, as tears, as powder, as sticks, ready to be placed upon charcoal or added to incense mixtures. The market for such materials is perhaps not as large as it once was, but it persists. There are those who value natural aromatic substances, who prefer them to synthetic fragrances. There are those who maintain traditional practices, whether religious or magical, in which dragon's blood plays a part. For these users, dragon's blood remains a valued commodity. Skincare products represent another contemporary application. Dragon's blood has been incorporated into various creams, serums, and other preparations intended for application to the skin. The marketing of such products often emphasizes the natural origin of the ingredient, its traditional use for healing, and the antioxidant or anti-inflammatory properties that scientific analysis has revealed. Whether dragon's blood in such products truly provides significant benefit remains a question. Whether its concentration is sufficient to exert meaningful effects, whether the other ingredients in these formulations enhance or diminish its activity. These are questions that would require careful study to answer definitively. What is clear is that manufacturers have found commercial value in including dragon's blood among the ingredients of their skincare lines. Cosmetics more broadly have also embraced dragon's blood. Beyond skincare, the resin or its extracts appear in various products. In lipsticks and lip balms, in tinted moisturizers, in products marketed as providing color, along with other benefits. The natural red pigmentation, the exotic name, the suggestion of ancient wisdom, all these factors make dragon's blood an appealing ingredient from a marketing perspective. Dietary supplements represent yet another contemporary use. Dragon's blood, typically in the form of powdered resin or concentrated extracts, is sold in capsules or as powder to be mixed into beverages. These supplements are marketed with various claimed benefits: support for digestive health, antioxidant effects, immune system support, and so forth. The regulatory status of such supplements differs from that of approved pharmaceuticals. They are not required to demonstrate efficacy through the rigorous testing applied to drugs. The claims made for them must be carefully worded to avoid promising to treat or cure diseases. Instead, speaking of supporting health or promoting wellness in more general terms. Consumers who purchase such supplements may be drawn by the traditional use, by the exotic origin, by a preference for natural products over synthetic pharmaceuticals, or by a belief that ancient remedies possess wisdom that modern medicine has neglected. Whether these supplements provide value proportionate to their cost is a question each user must judge for themselves based on their experience. Thus we find that dragon's blood occupies, in our present day, a position between several worlds. It retains a place in medicine through the approved pharmaceutical extract, confirming that at least one traditional use has validity by modern standards. It continues in ritual and spiritual practice for those who maintain such traditions. It has been embraced by the commercial worlds of cosmetics and supplements, where its exotic character and traditional associations provide marketing appeal. This positioning between medicine, ritual, and material craft is perhaps fitting for a substance with such a long and varied history. Dragon's blood has never been only one thing. From its earliest appearance in ancient trade routes to its current presence in multiple markets, it has been valued for diverse reasons by diverse peoples. The apothecary's jar of dragon's blood that once sat on my shelf, alongside jars of other simples and compounds, has been joined now by bottles of supplements in health food stores, by tubes of skincare products in fashionable shops, by packets of incense in specialty retailers, by pharmaceutical preparations in pharmacies. The substance itself remains what it has always been, a red resin from certain trees and palms. But the context in which it is understood, the uses to which it is put, the meanings attributed to it, these continue to evolve as they have throughout its long association with humanity. Closing. And so, having traced dragon's blood from its botanical origins through its collection and trade, through its many applications in medicine and craft, through its ritual uses and its chemical composition, arriving finally at its present-day status, I have completed this account. The candle burns low, the night advances. It is time, perhaps, to rest, to allow these many details to settle in the mind like sediment slowly drifting to the bottom of a vessel of water, eventually finding their proper place and order. I thank you for your attention this evening, for stepping closer to the light, for considering with me this crimson treasure from the tree that bleeds. May your own inquiries into the mysteries of the natural world prove fruitful, and may you find wisdom in the accumulated knowledge of those who came before. Until we meet again in this modest establishment, I bid you good evening.